Hello. Welcome back. Thank you all for being still here. It's great. My name is Chuck de Liederkirk. I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Soil Capital. We accompany farmers in their regenerative transitions and help them measure, certify, and monetize value from their improvements in carbon profiles. But I'm not here to talk about me. I am your panelist today for this second phase of the morning. And with me, I'm very glad to have three distinguished panelists that will join me on stage now. If I can ask Gerard Ross, Sébastien Roumgou, and Claude Saudet to join me, we can start this debate. Not a debate, actually. It's a panel. So, thank you, gentlemen. We have about an hour and 20 minutes. I think what we'll do is we'll take about an hour to have a conversation, and then we'll hand it over for questions after that. To begin with, I'm going to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, what matters to you in the context of carbon farming. And I'll immediately hand over to Gerard, who's prepared a presentation. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation also to be here. So I'm Gerard from Wageningen University. Being a researcher in environmental system analysis, and focusing on quantifying the benefits and trade-offs of carbon management in farming systems, but not only carbon, but also in relation to nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all the nutrients that are relevant for farming. So I directly continue with my short introduction on the topic.
Yeah, please.
Can I open my presentation then? Or? It's there.
There we go.
So it's about the question that you asked me is about to reflect on we are going to a carbon neutrality. Is that in agriculture? Is that possible? And if we focus on increases in soil organic carbon, what are then the benefits for biodiversity in relation to the zero farm-to-fork strategy and the zero pollution in agriculture? Thanks a lot. And I have 10 slides just to introduce the topic, because soil organic carbon, you already mentioned, is very complex. So I give 2 slides about what is soil organic carbon anyhow, and how can you manage that as a farmer, and what are the scientific and the agricultural challenges if you want to boost soil organic carbon in soil and to retain carbon there. And it's just a couple of scientific notes, reflections there, and being also a start point for the discussion probably later on. So it starts already in COP 2021 that in the European Union, the French Minister of Agriculture came with a 4 promille initiative. And after a lot of debate, they made a very simple statement, because they measured the total emissions on the globe. It's about 2,400 gigatons of carbon that is emitted. You can measure the total carbon stock in soil. They did estimate our 2-meter depth amount of carbon, and they divide both, and they said if each farmer can increase the soil organic carbon content with 4 promille a year, that is feasible with management measures, then you can basically mitigate all the CO2 emissions. Of course, in reality, there's a lot of debate on this calculation, on the underlying assumptions, and in reality, you need to do a little bit more. But okay, the ambition is set. And the European Union afterwards came with, let's say, the zero pollution strategy and the farm-to-fork strategy. And for agriculture, the ambitions are also high. They are not focusing on zero emission, because that's impossible for agriculture. It's by definition that CO2 is released, greenhouse gases are emitted. They say they have the ambition to reduce it with 50%, and the remaining 50% is mitigated by land use changes, from arable to grasslands, or from arable to forest and nature even. How is it realized? And I'm not repeating the former speaker, but a lot of measures are implemented via the CAP in the national policies for catch cropping, rotations, nature areas, and also on soil management measures to boost carbon. That's the mandatory part. You also have the increasing voluntary markets for about carbon. And the underlying question here is still not solved about if all these measures become mandatory via the CAP, via national regulations, what is then the additionality of the additional carbon? And is the additionality even then feasible within an economic feasible farming practice? Because the regulations are already quite straightforward. When you look to carbon in the soil, here is a very simplified carbon cycle. In reality, there are a million arrows to track. But the plants are sequestering carbon, taking CO2 from the air. Plant materials are eaten by animals or humans, and then the excreta are ending up in the soil, or the plant residues are ending up in the soil. And there it's decomposed, and the part that is difficult to decompose remain in the soil, and that's the soil organic matter. And you can basically simplify it as a decomposition part. The carbon is decomposed by soil life. So organic carbon in the soil is decomposed for energy for fungi, bacteria, earthworms, all the animals that are living in the soil. And there is carbon coming in the soil from plant residues, manure. That's it. And then if you add more carbon into the soil, then it's decomposed, then carbon in the soil is increasing. So that's something simple and straightforward. But how more you add to the soil, how bigger the decomposition becomes. So you're only going to a new equilibrium. So therefore you never, carbon sequestration never leads to a zero emission. How more carbon is sequestered, how more emission occur. There are a lot of benefits for the arable farming systems. Adding organic carbon, organic matter in soils improves quite a lot of soil functions. Supply of nutrients, retention of water, increasing soil biodiversity, reduce the disease sensitivity, so it's increasing the resistance. It supports the degradation of pesticides. So how more carbon is in the soil, how better the farming system can deal with changes due to climate change, due to variability in inputs. And that's particularly true when soil organic carbon is lower than 2%. So in all soil quality assessments globally, soil organic matter is always the first item that they measure. If it is sufficient, then you have a much more resilient farming system than you have less soil organic matter. Increasing soil organic carbon have a lot of benefits for soil health. And I just show here a map that I'm producing. I have produced. So if you increase 1% of organic carbon, you see globally an increase in soil health. So, and therefore also the resilience for crop production. And you see also here, the impact is spatially very variable. And in cases where you already have a lot of soil organic carbon, so that's in the boreal zone and also in Europe, part of Europe, that the impact of adding another percentage of carbon is much smaller than if you go to Africa, Brazil, and in the eastern part of the United States. Western part. So the impacts of carbon sequestration is not everywhere the same. And that's good when you also start about management options to solve. I focus on the scientific challenge that are currently on the debate in science, is that soil starts to saturate with adding carbon. And how more carbon is in the soil, how more difficult it is to additionally sequester carbon. So if you have regions where a lot of carbon has already been stored in the soil, don't focus too much on measures to increase it more. It's better focus your management on areas where soil organic carbon is rather low. We have the classic debate about land sharing versus land sparing. So if you extensify your agriculture, yield is usually declining. So that means you need to increase the area given the fact that food demand is still growing. And the impact of land conversion from nature to arable is one of the biggest impacts on soil organic carbon. Then the decline occurs. But as soon as you start to want to increase, we should be aware that all kinds of management measures that can be applied, and we will discuss later on, they always have impact on other environmental issues. Greenhouse gas emissions for methane and CO, besides CO2. Management affect also ammonia and therefore the biodiversity in nature areas. It affects the losses of nitrogen cations from the soil to the water system. And there we also have thresholds that we have to achieve. And of course we have soil health issues. So optimizing management in view of these different kind of objectives, there's no real solution yet. The fourth item is that the economic benefits are really weakly underpinned. So we all believe, and we have data that more carbon is beneficial, but is that really a cost-effective measure and compared to all other activities that farmers can do? There's very little scientific modeling and data analysis available for that. And I only like to stress here also that we also have to manage our expectations. There's a lot of expectations of carbon sequestration and the carbon market and the voluntary market, but changes in carbon are really slow. So you have to really to wait 10, 20, 30 years to increase 1% of carbon. And that also, if the price is only 100 euros per ton, you need to maintain soil organic matter for 30 years only to earn that 100 euros per ton. So that's quite an effort. But okay, that's the scientific challenges. Here are a couple of examples from the presentation will be shared. About management measures, what is the impact on soil organic carbon? And the impact is everywhere different. So soil life can be affected positively in one country and negatively in another country if you apply the same management measure. That makes that there is no single bullet to solve and to sequester carbon. So that's the scientific debate. And the only positive thing is that the amount of insights and research is really increasing exponentially. So I really believe that solutions will come up within a couple of years. If you look to the agricultural challenges from a cropland farming, then farmers have to improve soil organic carbon above the economic target. And that's then the carbon sequestration relevant for climate. That always requires a long-term perspective, so it changes your farming system. It's about crop rotation, tillage practices. These are not management measures that you do for 1 year and next year you do something else. So it will have impact on your turnover of your farm and also about all the management that you apply. At least in Western Europe, most of the crops that are beneficial for carbon are not economically attractive. So usually they cost even money. At least in the Netherlands, if you grow cereals, it costs you more money than you earn. So therefore, that's an issue that farmers have to solve. And you have the mitigation of trade-offs to the environment related to nitrate, groundwater, related to the surface water directive, nutrients and the biodiversity in surface waters, and also the nature and ammonia. And the second thing is about how do you then monitor carbon? There are a lot of companies now coming online with a lot of promises that they can measure soil organic carbon, but up to now, these techniques are not robust, reliable, and if they are reliable, then they are simply too costly. So if you have to pay 100 euros per year to monitor carbon, then all the costs of the benefits of sequestering carbon are already gone. So I hope and I see perspective for so-called sensor fusion techniques where handheld sensors are merged with satellite data to monitor that on a bigger scale. And these are really in R&D phase at the moment, and they will really help farmers to monitor, check, and adapt their management. My last slide is about the reflection on the oil, vegetable oil production. And before I want to make the analysis by myself, but I started in the literature, and then I discovered that it's just published 1 year ago, an holistic analysis of all the greenhouse gas emissions for vegetable oil production globally, where they collect more than 6,000 producers. They analyzed all the greenhouse gas emissions, and it's visualized here on the screen for the different land use impacts, cultivation impacts, and also the post-processing. in kilogram CO2 emissions equivalents per kilogram oil. And the only thing that I like to stress here, that is cultivation, so the farming practices still contribute quite significantly. So it's up to 4 kilogram CO2 emissions per kilogram oil. So adapting management on farm level in the production cycle can actually contribute to lowering the losses. And the bars show the variability in the existing farming systems. So there is a lot possible there if you learn and adapt the best practices for the different cultivations. It's also true that if you compare cultivation to land use changes that nature forest is converted to cropland areas, that is a factor 10 higher. So avoiding conversion from forestry and nature areas to cropland is much more effective than optimizing the management on the farm itself. It also means that if you can increase the production on your farm, it's not necessary to convert the nature area. Huh? So there's a lot of potential also here in the chain, from the farmer perspective, to contribute to lowering the losses. And that's my starting point for here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. You've touched on plenty of topics that have a very direct impact at field level for farmers. And with this in mind, I propose that you present yourself, Sebastian.
Thank you.
And I think you've prepared some slides.
Well. Hello, everyone. So I'm very pleased to be with you today. So I'm the founder of Biospheres, which is a consultancy company. We are working today mainly in Europe, in France, in Poland, Hungary, Italy, Spain, but also in few other countries in the world. And we are supporting like large-scale companies, food industry, luxury industries that you provide, actually. And we are working in this field to support them in their transition toward what we call today regenerative agriculture. So we will talk about that. Of course, you know, it's a new word that come from the US. What does it mean? Actually, the word is not very important. What is important is what is the future with this kind of agriculture for you as supplier? What does it mean for the farmers? And maybe the word will change within few years. You know, it's all the time the same. Before that was agroecology, now it's regenerative agriculture. I don't know, within 10 years that will be the agriculture for the fourth dimension or whatever, you know. But at the end, what does it mean for the farmer? What does it mean in the field? And how does it affect the carbon footprint of the farm? So that will be a little bit my presentation. I cannot see.
Can we?
Yeah, I don't have the presentation in front here. Okay, thank you. Okay, so basically just to start a few pictures. So you have two fields. Those two fields are just beside. The photos has been taken the same day. So you had a lot of rain this week. It was something like 70 millimeters, something like that. And as you can see, on one field, the water does not infiltrate, and on the other field, the water infiltrates a lot. So, and we are not talking about like organic agriculture or whatever. We are talking about what we call conservation agriculture, reducing soil tillage, so it's direct seeding, using a lot of cover crops, and not just crop rotations, and using glyphosate as well. So it's not organic. But it's really interesting to see how after 7 years of this kind of agriculture, we can infiltrate water much more. How we can increase a little bit. Of course, it's not like 2% organic matter, but at least you concentrate your organic matter in the thin layer. So you concentrate this increase in 5 centimeters, 7 centimeters. So you have many services on the 7 centimeters. You have much more earthworms. What we measure is like 7-10 times more earthworms in this field than in the field beside. So that means changing the practices, you can bring value. It's called natural capital, you know, it's called ecosystem services. And my belief 10 years ago when I was starting Biospheres was it's possible to not decrease the yield but increase the environmental benefits of farming, being in the same time economically interesting for the farmer. So that's the journey we try to do with Biosphere. So today Biosphere is one holding company I own, and 3 additional services which are companies or brands. So what we are doing basically is to provide like long-term projects for the companies I just mentioned: Mars, Unilever, Danone, Pernod Ricard, LVMH, and so on and so forth, Chanel. And we work with them to support the farmers on the ground, or to support cooperatives, wholesalers in their journey to transform the way they are supporting farmers. We are doing a lot of training, and we focus a lot on soil science. So I just show you this not to say, okay, you know, I have muscles. I show you this because those are the final customers. So the final customer wants some specificity in their final products. They buy from you the raw materials. And that's interesting because in the debate we will have today, my aim is to provide you what will be the future market. What is beyond carbon even, because they are asking about the scope 3 and the carbon, but maybe they will ask to something else in the next future, and that's important for me to actually speak about that today. So when we are transforming the practices, that's important to understand that there is a pathway, and it's important to not go too fast. So that's what we do when we start a project. We start from day one. We start with specificity of the farm, specificity of the farmers, the objective of the farmers, and we are setting a roadmap for him. And in this roadmap, of course, 80% of our projects deal with carbon footprint. So we try to affect the carbon footprint of the farm while we are supporting the farmer. So it's like we are working on reduced tillage because it's safe fuel. We are working in soil fertility because when you increase soil fertility, you can decrease a little bit fertilizers use, especially nitrogen. We are also avoid overuse of nitrogen, and it can happen a lot, especially in Eastern Europe. Now in France, UK, and so on, most of the time they are reduced a lot, the nitrogen use in the field, but it's something we should work on. And we are working a lot on, for soil fertility, cover crops, crop rotations. So that's some practices that are interesting. And because in terms of carbon, you have some emission drivers and sequestration drivers that affects the carbon footprint of a farm. So that's what we do usually. So for the emission drivers, mainly it's nitrogen and fuel, and sequestration drivers mostly is organic matter management, increasing the amount of dry matter of plant biomass you are introducing in your systems along the crop rotation. So that's what we do basically, and that was important for me to show you some examples, and we will have a debate around what those companies are asking. It's carbon, it's scope 3, and also the co-benefits, as we discussed a little bit. Water, biodiversity, soil fertility are intermingled with the carbon topic, and that's something we are working on. And yeah, we will see what happens in this debate.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. So then, representing the farmers, we have Claude. Claude, do you care to say a few words about yourself?
Thank you. I'm Claude Soudet. I'm working for FOP, French Oilseed and Protein Crops Producers Union. We represent around 90,000 producers on oilseeds and around 25,000 on grain legumes. We are involved with this issue of carbon because, of course, farmers are impacted by climate change. They want to reduce their footprint in this area, but also they want to be part of the solutions. But when we are speaking about carbon, it's not so easy. We have to take account that not all the soils are the same, not all the climates are the same, not the environmental, economic environment of the farm is the same. And when you want to evolve, transform your farm, you have to take into account all of these elements. But that's not all. We are also on the impact of European policies and national policies. And for instance, CAP has quite a big influence there on what we are able to do or not, but also will have an impact on what could be possible in next years, because one of the issue is that we have too frequent policy changes with new goals, and maybe some of these goals that were paid, I will say, at one time, 5 years after, they are not anymore paid, but there are new ones, and it's quite difficult to develop a way to incentive farmers to transform, to change what they have done on their farm. So what's something that's clear? There are agronomic issues with carbon, but we should not. I want to focus on also the economic ones, because transform the way the practices on the farm, it's cost, it's new cost. These costs are not always taken into account, and it's more difficult when EU do that these new practices are mandatory, but only for the EU production. With commodities, we are not protected from outside. So we should also take into account that French and European farming need to stay competitive. And we also need that if some improvements are put in place, we may have benefits, but we also have some cost, and all the chain should pay for this and should agree with these concepts. Because if not, we will not be able to progress there. We try to see how farmers could get a share of services they are giving to society. Environmental services, for instance, carbon, for instance. There are different possibilities to be rewarded for this. It could be in the products we are selling. It could be maybe in contracts on environmental services. It may also be with carbon credits, on the voluntary market of carbon credits. French farmers, crop farmers, try to develop, to go in the proposal of the Ministry of Environment and develop low carbon credit. And we try to work on this issue to propose a methodology with our technical institutes to have something that is doable for farmers, that we are able to manage, and take into account a lot of issues that were precedent speakers speak about this morning, such as permanent of storage of carbon. But when we are speaking about permanent of storage, you should not forget that farmers may evolve their farms. If they are changing their rotation, there will be a new equilibrium. We are not in forest. We are not capturing CO2 to put in soil. We are dealing with the elements, and these elements are moving in an economic context. So that's something we need also to take into account, and we try to go there too. The last maybe word I would say is about the different initiatives that could be taken by the policies. For instance, I was thinking to European policies in the WED, the Energy Renewable Directive. We were able to have some remuneration for good practices with biofuels with low emissions. When you are changing the rules, for instance, the SK factor, we are going from something that was managed with EPCC factors, going to analysis of soil to do each 5 years. It's more costly, but it's really dependent on what will be the climatic condition of the year. And at the end, it is less incentive for farmers. The situation will be worse for them. Another example is the carbon removal certification. When we are speaking of this, Commission only speak about carbon removals, not the whole chain. But to have carbon removal, we need to produce more. You need to increase the biomass. It may go to emissions, to increase the emissions. When we develop a label in France, low carbon label in France, we take into account removals and emissions. So it's a net balance that is taken into account. And we said that every ton of carbon that is not emitted, we don't have to capture it and to store it. So it's, for the society, it's the same value as storing carbon. So it should be treated the same way. I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claude. So what I've heard in all of your presentations is somehow there's a tension between productivity and profitability on the one hand. I noted something that you said, crops boosting soil organic carbon are economically less attractive. And on the other hand, we have carbon farming, sustainable farming, regenerative agriculture that seems to be less productive. So you can either, save the world or have a business, if you put it in really stark terms. Let's explore that. I think that's the first question I want to have, and I want to turn it over to Claude in a first instance. Do you think that that choice is as radical as I'm putting it?
I think that we are able to improve the situation in some form if all the elements are taken into account. And the way that farmers also earn some income from these new things. With our institute, we are doing some research to do what are the best rotations, for instance, adapt to the different regions with the crops that are adapt to these regions, to see what is the best way to be able to produce, limiting emissions, and have an income. But it's not so easy because things are moving. For instance, to reduce nitrogen, you can use associate crops. Maybe you can use rapeseed and legumes. But this works if these legumes are freezing in winter. If frost in the winter, maybe you have some issue at one moment when you want to harvest. So how to manage this, how to find the way to have these evolutions. The nitrogen issue, it's a very important part of the emissions. I agree on this. Precision farming is a tool, and crop rotation is also a tool to manage this, to try to manage this. But this means that when we are doing such things, if we are growing legumes, we need to have markets for them, and markets that are as remunerative as other crops, if we want farmers are choosing this way and not another one.
Thank you. I see you've been speaking of added fertility when you shift to regenerative systems. Sébastien, you're talking about the fact that actually there might be some compatibility there. Can you explain a little bit more what you see on the ground with farmers?
Yeah, actually, how we are doing. Actually, I completely agree. We start with a full audit of the farm, including the farmer objectives, the machinery he has, the capability to invest, the climate, type of soils. And then from this point, we start the journey. The first step is to change the system in such a way that you don't need to invest. For instance, if the guy is plowing before wheat, actually it's unuseful. He's just wasting money. So we will go in reduced tillage in many crops without taking any risk. If he's putting too much nitrogen because he wants too much in terms of yield, he's aiming, the yield is doing 1 year every 10 years. because he wants the best yield. Actually, he's overusing nitrogen 9 years you know what I mean? So it's a kind of changing the way he's thinking about competitiveness. Then we can reduce the cost overall on the farm. So most of the time we can save money from machinery, input use, without investing. If we are not going into direct seeding, we don't have to buy a new seeder, which is 100,000 euro. So that's the first step. According to the soil status. So if the soil is less than 2% of organic matter, or like 1.2, 1.3, we need to increase the soil fertility before reducing too much the soil tillage and going into direct seeding, which seems to be a kind of good way to reduce the emission, or at least to increase the sequestration and so on and so forth, even if we have debate on that, because you have nitrous emission that can increase and CO2 that can decrease. But anyway, that's an expert debate. So it's a kind of planifying everything economically. Most of the time, if you are going into agroecology, like from one day to another, and you are buying new things and you are doing everything without support, you can fail. And people say, oh, it doesn't work. You are just choosing the environment and not the economy. But actually, both can be combined, but you have to think from the beginning. And you have to not go into big investments before everything is going well. Your soil, your skills, because that's new skills. You mentioned it, when you are doing like you combine rapeseed and companion crops, it's a new techniques. You have to change a little bit your crop rotation as well. That's important. You have to include more cover crops. You have to include more fresh organic matter in your crop rotation in order to generate more organic matter content in your soil, but also to structure naturally your soil, to reduce your soil tillage. So it's a kind of combination of things. I think that's complex because most of the time we have a kind of linear view of farming systems. Like to produce rapeseed, it's seeds and some inputs and harvest. But actually we have to take everything into account, like the previous crop, the cover crops, what we will do next. So it's a kind of changing a little bit the way you are thinking about your farming systems. But actually for me there's no opposition. And I'll tell to my team, if you are supporting the farmer in such a way that he will earn less money and spend more time in the field, it's not the right systems. Most of the time, if you propose something on the paper, it should be the same cost. So you save machinery and you put more cover crops, so you save money and you put more money. But the cover crop is an investment, it's not a cost. Soil tillage is a cost, because you're going to till the soil and you pay something and that's it. With cover crop, you pay something, but you get organic matter and more soil life. So you have profit from a cover crop, but you don't have profit from tillage. So that's also a new way of thinking about cost. You have cost and investments. That's not the same. So it's very important for me to put the economics and the workload from the beginning when you are designing new farming system. And most of the time, ecologists, I would say, just are looking about biodiversity and so on and so forth, and they don't care if the yield is like going down by 50%. They don't care if the quality is going down a lot. But if we don't care, actually it's not acceptable for the farmers, and you have to compensate everything and pay whatever. But yeah.
If I may add something on this.
Sure.
There is another element that we have to take into account, is the regulations, the mandatory part of the regulation.
Yeah.
Because when you want to introduce cover crops, okay, we agree with this. But with the CAP today, we have to have these cover crops from this day to this one, whatever are the climate conditions. Maybe sometimes they will never go.
May I add another question? Because I really like your approach that you look on farm level, what is the current status, and you have somewhere in mind also a desired one, and then you move from the current one to the desired by optimizing management. That's particularly, let's say the starting point, all the things that are currently wrong, let's say, you need to adapt. But there is already a huge group of farmers, also led by regulation, but also learned by the lessons from the past, that are already very efficient, and they have already maintained soil quality at a certain level. What kind of recommendation would you then give to them? Because there is no option to further optimize anymore, because they are very efficient, and now they need to basically to extensify from all the regulations, and then the only way is that that extensivation costs them money. because they are not able to intensify anymore.
So that's why we should not be like carbon-centric or whatever. If your farming system is okay, if you earn money, if the workload is okay, and if your soil is 3% organic matter because your grandfather and your father learn you that cover cropping and soil organic matter is important, I mean, you are green in terms of indicators. So the bad thing is, if you are going into a carbon sequestration or carbon footprint program, maybe you will earn less because you are good from the beginning, and that's not fair. That's another problem we can have in this program, is that if you are very bad at the first step, you can get more money from the carbon because you have so many efforts to do. So I don't know how to compensate that, but. If you are good, you are good. You know, sometimes I don't understand why people. Sometimes because in the media, people are saying that some like conventional agriculture is always bad. People think that they are bad. So you go on the farm and they think, okay, what I can improve? But if everything is okay, we have to optimize the cost. Maybe if you want to do more effort on pesticide and fertilizer, taking a little bit more risk, we support him in the journey. If you want to go into organic, we can support him to the journey. But anyhow, if it's okay, it's okay. So.
But there's an underlying debate, at least that I discover, is that it depends, of course, where you are in Europe. But if you, let's say in the Netherlands, I think the emissions per kilogram product are the lowest. But the emissions per hectare are the highest. So you are optimizing basically your production, because that's the only variable that's different. Yeah. So, and that means that if you reduce then the inputs, you also reduce production, and then somewhere else it needs to be improved.
I think you're pointing to a very interesting topic, which is the way you account for all these externalities and the impact. If you're measuring on a per hectare, per ton basis, you're going to solve for different topics. Yeah. You're going to get paid for different topics, and you're going to have different externalities. This ties to the question about frameworks, regulation, standards, and we see many regulations, frameworks, and standards out there on the topic of carbon alone, but also now we're starting to talk about biodiversity, we're talking about water and all this. So, you know, who's not confused? Raise your hand.
Not confused.
I didn't think so. Yeah. So, you know, I understand that you advise some of these standard bodies. Yeah. How do you navigate the world of standards today? What should we be looking at to be less confused?
That's indeed a challenging question too. So, but there is a direction, at least to the monitoring of critical performance indicators that they call, and that's already the good starting point, because they already monitor more than only carbon. So you have a carbon balance, but you also look to the biodiversity on your farm, the amount of nature area, the nitrogen surpluses, the phosphorus surpluses, in relation to the environmental impact. So that allows you already to at least to monitor your impact on your environment. At the same time, all the existing ones, as far as I'm aware of, they are still quite one-dimensional. So they focus only to one aspect and not to the others one. And then, if you look into your story, it's all in, let's say, the policy development. It's in scientific development. But if you, most farmers just ask me, and how much get I paid if I do actual improvement? But that's not a relevant question from the policies at the moment. They just say you have to fulfill all these requirements. And then the how, that's open. And then I think companies like you come in with strategies. How can you make improvements on these critical performance indicators?
Okay, so let's explore that. Let's explore it from a payment point of view. You know, what do you feel is the right economic incentive, Claude, to get farmers going into a direction of, you know, meeting the farm to fork and Green Deal goals?
It depends what they have to do. What is their own situation and what improvement they have to manage. But one, I will say, difficulty there, and I also listened to what said the first presentation this morning, when the Commission is saying that this will be a way to generate a new income for farmers. No. Maybe it's a way today to pay for a transition, but those who are good, they will not be paid more for this, except if we are able to have some contracts for environmental services or things like that, but they will not be able to be paid for carbon. And years after years, with the evolution of the regulation, it will be less because you need, in the concept we have today, we need to have additionality. It's new measures. So in the regulation, you are putting years after years the measures, the improvement that you can do. What can you do at the end? What is the new thing that will improve the situation? The only one we keep is to reduce the inputs, so decline the production. But if we are declining the production, we are going to a new equilibrium, but we are releasing carbon at what time? Or emissions at what time?
So this additionality topic, and I want to make it clear for everyone in the room by framing it with a concrete example. A farmer who has been a pioneer for a long time, he has attained the right equilibrium for soil fertility in terms of carbon, notices that he cannot store carbon anymore in his soil because of that new equilibrium. And the only way for the farmer to get paid is to actually remove that carbon from the soil in the first place, dig it out, and then, arrive in a carbon payment program and say, hey, I can be eligible. And that's a terrible thing. I mean, it goes against all of our goals. Have you seen this happening today, Sébastien? What's your view on this?
Yeah, actually, have I seen that? It's we are in a different situation because I'm working mainly for private. I'm not really keen on regulation. I know it, but it's more when we start a program with a big company, we are setting the right KPI framework, what we are looking for, carbon, soil fertility, biodiversity, water, or whatever. And then that's rules for a contract, which is between the farmer and the provider and the final buyer. And of course, there are incentives. But these incentives is negotiated, between the farmers and everyone. So it ranges between, for grain, for instance, or rapeseed, grain especially because we're working a lot of grain, but rapeseed is starting. But it ranges between 10%, 15% more than the standards of the market, something like that. So additional to any other source of remuneration, and sometimes we try to find other source of remuneration that comes from public regulations or whatever. So that's what we do, and for me, that's important. That's a real tension. Do we have to pay the farmer for the ecological services he's providing, even if between system 1 and system 2 is earning more money and spending less time in the field, which is feasible, actually, for cropping systems such as cereals and so on. For me, yes.
But can I interrupt you? What happens today with the price of carbon for agricultural carbon in Western Europe? You're looking at 55, 60 euros. If for a ton of CO2 equivalent, what happens when that price goes to 150, like the IPCC is?
So it really depends on the project. But most of the time, when the farmer is signing with the supplier or the buyer, like the food industry or whatever, is losing his right to sell the carbon into an open market. So it's like you take the incentive from your contract, and that means your carbon footprint improvement is going to the scope 3 of the final buyer. That can be Mars, that can be Unilever, that can be Chanel or whatever. So that's the deal, actually. And that's a real debate we should have. Where the money must come from, at which price, do we have to put value on all the co-benefits? And I don't like this word, like co-benefits. It's like you have the carbon, which is the main topic, and the co-benefits. It's not the right things. Actually, carbon is one cycle, which is connected to the water cycle, which is connected to the biodiversity, which is connected to soil fertility. So it's a kind of, everything is intermingled. But today's regulation is not taking into account the importance of each factors. We are very carbon-centric, and for me that's a mistake, because farming is 50% of the land use. So that means if you want to have a good water cycle and biodiversity development, you need to affect those surface in the right way. And for me, the farmer must be paid for that. Because if you have good water infiltration and that means you replenish the watershed, you are providing water for the cities, that's a kind of cost saving for the cities, So it's a kind of, for me, that's important that the regulatory system is taking that into account, but I'm not in it. I don't want to go in it. We are working for private because it's more convenient and we have a lot of market for that. But I'm sure you have something to say about that because...
But I like basically to confirm, because what I really see that stimulates farmers to innovate and to adapt is that you give them clear goals.
Yeah.
Up to now, all the environmental goals are goals for groundwater bodies. The Netherlands as a whole. Farmers are not motivated to achieve to that, and they have no possibilities to monitor the impact even on that goal, because an environmental objective is a measure affected by the community as a whole. So I think, and then these KPIs that you use and that are also in development nowadays, these actually help to translate all these objectives into something that you can measure on your farm. And then you have the debate and discussion that I see in a couple of countries now, that governments are making regulations, basically making decisions for the farm themselves. So in the Netherlands, you are not allowed to harvest your crop anymore after the 1st of October for a long series of crops. So you basically ignore the variability in weather, and you just say, a farmer, you have to harvest before that date, ignoring all the so if you give the farmers actual goals, then it's up to them to achieve that on the best way. And I'm really sure that they can handle that, and they have a lot of innovation and creativity to deal with that. And then, of course, you have to monitor also that you actually do that.
I just want something small, like what you said is very true. And I think that's why the private supply chain that we are building are successful. That's because we kick off the program with the farmers. We are very clear about the objective we are setting with the farmers. It's like level 1 and level 2. That's you have to change these practices. It brings to these incentives, and it's logical because we build the program with the farmers.
Sébastien, if I may, can you do a case study of one of your corporate clients? Why do they engage with you? What are they looking for? What do you achieve for them? How do they engage with the farmers? And what are they looking for from the farmer?
I am under NDAs everywhere, but as like general,
we'll circulate some other NDAs.
Yeah, it's like I have a pile of NDAs. It's so full, so I cannot say anything. But anyway, so it's like when we are starting a project, most of the time we must be aligned with the farmer profile we have. So if we work in Poland, it's not the same that we work in the south of France. It's not the same if we work in Spain. And so we build the program along with the supplier, that can be a cooperative or whatever, the final buyer, that can be a food industry or luxury industry, and we build it with the farmers according to the different profile. You have leaders that are very good in regenerative agriculture, you have followers, and you have reluctant. So we try to understand how the supply chain is organized, and we start the program onboarding the farmers which can be the most valuable to set the right practices on the ground. Then we can show that it works. So we have a pilot phase, which is 3 to 4 years, where we build the new technical references locally with a few bunch of farmers. It can be 30, 40, 50 farmers.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. What is the definition of success of one of your clients when they engage you?
Actually, we are designing what is the evolution in terms of practices and systems. We set it in a very clear framework. We evaluate where are the farmers currently, and then we have to increase the number of farmers that are going into the practices we define. Most of the time, that's practices which are linked with soil fertility, like reducing soil tillage, more cover crops, more natural infrastructures, reducing pesticide and fertilizers. So, But we define the objective along with the farmers. It's not like we are not asking for something which is not feasible.
And your corporate customers, they're looking for security of supply, license to operate, regulatory compliance. What is their rationale to act on this?
Actually, they want to comply with some regulation, especially the scope 3. They want to match their requirement in terms of non-financial objectives that we are selling. They are selling to their financer and their customers. And they want to be sure that they can, it's a kind of sourcing security. So they want to be sure that the sourcing will be okay along with the climate change.
Okay.
So that's...
Claude, I feel you want to say something.
And they want to differentiate themselves to the final consumers.
Yeah.
Of course. But there is something that is not taken into account in this. We are on commodities market, volatile commodities market. And the issue is how to incentivize farmers to do this on a long time. Yeah. When you say when you have rapeseed prices at 800, it's not the same as it is at 400. And maybe you are ready to do efforts not in the same way. And this is also something that should be taken into account. How to incentivize farmers to go in this? Is it beneficial for them on the long term? I think we agree, but we have to manage the transition.
Yeah.
But how to be sure that on the long term, they will not only have work for the final client or the final customer.
I say probably a nice example from the Netherlands, where Rabobank, as a financial partner and an insurance company, they had a lot of discussion about soil health. How can we improve that? And then they, together with the scientists, they developed a framework to assess soil quality and give it basically a number. And as soon as they have a number, they can use that also in reporting for sustainability to the financial markets. And actually, they are now able to give farmers a rent cutting. They have to pay less for the rent that they have to pay for the fields. And that's even 5 or more %, so that's quite a lot. And then they make an ambition of soil health. It was always fake. It's measurable, and as soon as it's measurable, there's also money for making things sustainable.
So let me bounce off of that to talk about something that you mentioned earlier, Claude, which is the cost of measurement, reporting, verification. On the one hand, you have, this is the greenwashing debate. On the one hand, you want farmers to get paid well, and there needs to be minimal effort so that we can show. We have many farmers doing it, but on the other hand, it needs to be scientifically robust. And so you kind of need to balance. If you're too scientifically robust, you're going to be soil sampling every day. It's going to be prohibitive. And how, in the mind of a researcher who's very involved in these topics, how do you strike the right balance between scientific robustness and farmer engagement?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if I ask my colleagues, they have much more questions about exact timing that you have to measure and there are a lot of measurements, scientific measurements available, but they are simply just too costly. You have to pay more than 1,000 euros or $1 per hectare, so no one is doing that. But there's also a movement now that agricultural laboratories nowadays also measure 50 parameters for each soil, with near infrared and all kinds of new techniques. Farmers have that data. And you can make use of that information because that data is monitored at least once in 4 or 5 years, and that's for soil quality more than sufficient. And you can use the same data that you collect already on your farm from your own management also to show your impact on the environment. And then you don't necessarily need all these other expensive measurements anymore. Although there is still evolvement and evolution there, because biological measurements, they are still expensive and they are still in, let's say, there's a lot of scientific development there, how to interpret biological indicators. Chemistry is known, physics is known, biology is a lot of uncertain. And in my view, you cannot ask a farmer to take a lot of biological measurements if you cannot interpret them. So what is the optimum value? As long as you don't know that, don't request that as a mandatory input in all kinds of monitoring systems.
And I have, yeah, please.
One of the questions is, can we do without going for some measurement directly on farm? Can we use remote satellites, something like that, or can we rely on models?
Something
Because
that Gerard
researchers-
proposed was
researchers work quite a lot on models. Maybe we can rely on them.
big data, tying soil measurements to satellite. Some companies are working on this for the moment. So, yes, I think that's very interesting. I want to get you to react to a quote regarding the public sector and the common agricultural policy in particular. And this shout out to Koen, who referred this report from the European Court of Auditors. This is the quote. Overall, we found that the 100 billion of CAP funds attributed during the 2014-2020 period to climate action had little impact on agricultural emissions, which have not changed significantly since 2010. Most mitigation measures supported by the CAP have a low potential to mitigate climate change. The CAP rarely finances measures with high climate mitigation potential. And it goes on along the same theme to say that they don't see any substantial change there. What is the role of the public sector in driving the climate agenda in contrast to the one of the private sector?
This is quite difficult because the CIP was financed for some specific objectives. And the objectives were not, at the beginning, climate. If we want to pay for climate issues, this needs to be additional money, I would say. Because today, what is given is to pay for transitions, it's to pay for what is not done, the difference of competitivity with the rest of the world, somewhere. And if we are always saying that this should be for new objectives, it's what always is the situation. With the 2013 CIP, we have conditionality and we have greening. In greening, we need to have 5% EFA. We need to maintain permanent pastures. We need to have diversity in crops on the farms. And we have a payment for this, 1/3 of the total payment of national level. When you are going to 2023, the new CIP, beginning from this year, you have an enhanced conditionality in which all these elements are greening are input, no more money, but if you are not doing all these elements, you will be punished, I will say. You will have a penalty because you are not doing with this, and there is no eco scheme that is more organized with climate. So the things are always evolving, but at what time we should not forget for why payments were given to farmers and what is our situation today, especially on commodities, in relation with the rest of the world. We are not protected. Someone was speaking about CBAM this morning. We are not protected for this. Maybe nitrate fertilizers are protected by CBAM, but not farmers for their commodities.
Yeah. So before I open it up to questions, and you can already start thinking about your questions if it's not done already, really, really quickly, I'm going to ask a left field question. If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing in the farming sector today, what would it be? Who wants to go first? Claude.
There are so many things that we need today. We need to have. We need the ability to produce. This means that we need means of production. If we are not able to produce, we will not be able to feed, and not be able to have carbon. So we need to be able to produce. This means varieties, this means inputs, this means water, this means a lot of things like this.
Thank you. Jared?
I have a lot of technical innovations that I would like, but I think it's more important because we are in a transition to another kind of agriculture. I think that the connection between consumers and food production should be much, much stronger than currently. And most people go to the shop and they buy their food without knowing the actual work and all the impacts of that food production. And I think if you connect food production more with, let's say, education and with that the consumers know how to produce unhealthy food, then you can solve already a lot of, let's say, socio-economic issues that basically limiting now farmers to extensive farm, making a financial healthy company with the food production that they have. They are all willing, but they are all limited by financial constraints nowadays. And I think if consumers, or we basically, and all our others, are more connected with the farming practices themselves, I'm not sure how to do it, but it should be feasible. I think that we will have a much more resilient and on the long term sustainable agriculture.
Thank you. Sebastian.
That's a complex question. I would say I would ask for a common vision, because if we want to go somewhere, we need to understand the final destinations. And I would say if we put money and efforts by designing new farming systems in such a way that we combine economy and environment and agronomy, I would say within 10 years we will find all the way. So I would say maybe more budget on that by doing things on the field to adapt the technical itineraries of farmers with farmers, and that can be economically viable in the economical context, which is open, and we face worldwide some competitors which are using much more inputs and whatever. So we have to take this distortion into account.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Questions from the audience? Yes, the gentleman in the second row. Do we have a microphone?
Thank you. I have some couple of points, and I will be happy to receive some comments from our experts. Sorry, Natalie, they will be technical, but this discussion is really, really important, and great thanks for FEDIOL to accelerate such a discussion. First point is the straw, because as far as I know, the regenerative agriculture recommends to keep the straw on the field to build the matter, the organic matter, what Sebastian mentioned. But from the other hand, when we look on the methodology of calculation of the GHG emissions, it's multiplying nitrous oxide. It's the most important part of this part of the emission. So if the straw is on the field, our emissions are really, really high, and it is proved. And this is the official calculation that Commission is recommending to use to the farmers. Second thing is a crop rotation. You mentioned about the direct sowing, and there is an option to use 5 or even 7 plants on the field in the crop rotation. So the question is, especially for big farms that are oriented on the market, what kind of plants they can produce, because I cannot see such a number of market options, because we don't have sugar beet anymore. We have only grains and oilseeds. Third thing is direct sowing. Once again, of course, it's limiting tillage and the cultivation, but from the other hand, it's multiplying using pesticides, especially herbicides. So it's not in line with the farm to fork strategy. We won't be able to use more herbicides, but it's needed because there's no any alternative for keeping healthy yields. And last thing is water management. I agree totally with Sebastian that when it's direct sowing, there's a better water management if there are rainfalls. But if there is no water, all the researchers said that tillage is keeping water. So the problem is how we can assess in long term what would be the better solution, because I believe that the added value of the simplification of agriculture would be not in the next or second year, it would be 10 years or even more. So, thanks.
I'll direct the question to you.
Okay, so it's many questions. So thank you for asking them. Of course, nothing is perfect, and I will start with the carbon calculation. When you say, why to put a cover crop in summer if it's so dry that the cover crop doesn't grow? So what you can do in your fields. I won't say it because it's public, but I know what I advise to the farmer, you know, because I don't want him to do something which is unuseful. So you have the regulation on one side and you have common sense on the other side. So for me, that's why we should not be too much carbon-centric. It seems to be weird because you need to stick to the regulations. But at the end, if the regulation is really weird, because you are trying to affect plenty of factors and not only the carbon on the farms, that's important to prioritize. So I would say for this, if you have a farmer that can save 1 hour per hectare by changing the soil tillage management, and at the end it can affect the nitrous oxide emission or whatever, but if the farmer is earning a lot with that, we have to find the balance. It's a cost-benefit ratio. So that's my point, but I'm not a regulation guy, you know, so that's why I'm not focusing a lot on that. For the practices you are talking about, actually, it's a design which is really specific. For the crop rotation, I completely agree with you. If we are in places where we can do a lot of spring and winter crop, we can diversify and we can find a way to have 5-6 crops. When we are in places where the weather allows us to do only winter crop, it's much more difficult. And it's also much more difficult to include cover crops in the rotation. So we adapt all the time, so we don't have like one solution for any kind of climate and soil conditions. What we have?
You had nitrous oxide, the crop rotations, direct tillage, and water management.
Okay, and what about direct tillage? I agree with you. Actually, if I have some constraint, like I don't want glyphosate, I cannot go direct seeding. So I do shallow tillage and I adapt my crop rotation in such a way that I don't have like plenty of raygrass that happens in my fields. And if I have it, I have to go back to plowing because that's the only means I have if I don't have herbicide. So we have to be pragmatic. I'm not like an ideologistic guy. But when you are using plowing, it's like you are using a pesticide for me. It's not like something which is interesting all the time. So it's completely different if you start like one people which is plowing like 80% of the time and plowing like 5% of the time if he has really big wheat problems. So that's the kind of evolution we are doing. We must not be like extreme, because with extreme you have extreme problem as well. But we have to all the time adapt. What we can see is that with shallow tillage, you can manage weed pressure. If you combine with some crop rotation, especially if you have the ability to do 2 spring and 2 winter crop, you can have something which is balanced. That's in some places. So I cannot, I would say, I must have a kind of study case to answer the question and technically, but what we do most of the time is to adapt to the current situation and not being like, being in a kind of ideology. Yeah, but for me, you know, when I'm speaking about glyphosate, for instance, I saw the best soil fertility and the best soil biota, like a lot of biodiversity in my soil under conservation agriculture with a little bit of glyphosate and some chemical fertilizer as well. And that's difficult to accept for some part of the population, especially organic. I love organic, and my family is farming organically, but I know that it's not the best system to have the best soil. So it's a kind of, you know, not being into belief, but going into science and techniques. And I think we are too much going into belief when we are talking about regulation and politics. Most of the time, people are just saying what they think, but what they think sometimes does not relate to reality.
Thanks. I realize we have 4 minutes left, and I'm sure there are other questions. any further questions at this stage? Yes, Koen.
Yeah, thanks. So Koen Blomsma for FEDIOL Secretariat. Chuck, thank you very much for having led this discussion and having looked at the topic from so many different angles. Very good. Zooming in on one of the angles you took, what is driving food industry, right, to go for regen ag, or how you call that. I was really wondering, because still, and Claude was already referring to commodities, right? Still, a lot of commodities are bought on the market without knowing where they come from, right? So will this whole discussion about soil carbon and improving carbon practices seen from the food industry, right? Will this also drive traceability and indeed increase in traceability of commodities? Eh?
Claude, do you have a view on that?
It could be good if all the chain is able to do something on traceability and is ready to say for where it's come from. Maybe it will be a way in some case to explain that the practices are not the same all over the world, and we have to choose with low prices or higher prices, but not the same practices.
And I think it's a development that's actually growing nowadays. For example, an example from Starbucks, they are now building also a tracing system from the beginning to the end. So then all the farmers with elder fields, they have to monitor and they can track all the flows. And I think much more, also on your presentation, you gave all the big company names. Yeah. I think they also do that from a tracking perspective. So you like to know the real production efforts from the beginning to the emissions to the end. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. When we're arriving in an era of data on the farms, and the moment you have the data on the farms, you can address that problem much more easily.
That's an assumption, eh?
Well, it's a good point. You know, 90% of the farmers we work with. Well, no, sorry. We've realized that in France today, 90% of the farmers still don't operate their FMIS system reliably. 90%. That's true. So, you know, we're not there yet at all, but it's step by step. Yes, sir. Second row.
Milan Kuncic and Agrofert. Well, actually, just one comment regarding the traceability. Probably here in Europe, we are able to do that, you know, really from the field towards the product. But you know, the voluntary schemes, I'm afraid they don't have such a power outside in the world. Yeah, and that's why we have fake papers. That's why we have, you know, products that are coming to Europe with very low emissions. Nobody believes in. Yeah, so. I think that is the weakest point in the whole system, yeah, that we cannot actually control the flows that are coming outside of Europe. Any comment to the panel?
Very interesting. Flows coming outside of Europe, competitiveness.
It's a permanent issue. How to be sure that what it's arriving inside EU. We have the case now with biofuels, for instance.
But would you not expect that if there's a real carbon market at some point, that you have a price that big companies are not paying for, I would expect, for carbon mitigation if it is not well proven? So that, of course, you will always have that kind of partners, but
that might act as a normalizing factor. Although I was discussing yesterday at dinner these amazing loopholes that I've just learned about, where you know, oil coming from China can be requalified as used food oil to come into the markets and bypass all of the regulations. The deforestation topic is applicable to livestock. It's not applicable to poultry. You know, it's going to be a while before this stuff happens. But
But
Yeah.
it's a step by step.
Exactly.
You're completely right. In all the regenerative supply chain started in Europe because it's more convenient. Somehow they have FMS or they work with cooperative with this kind of tool. We can harvest more data. And even if we go in mass balance approach, not segregated one, we can at least know the farmer which are delivering the product in the silos. But for the other countries, they are starting to push pressure on the suppliers, even brokers like generalistic brokers, to go back to the upstream suppliers, because otherwise it's impossible to make this regenerative supply chain, because they need to understand what happens on the fields. So I guess it will be more and more easy to get the full traceability, but it's a long journey, I guess, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this brings us to the end of this second panel. Maybe one last thought to leave you with as I was listening to this very interesting conversation. When we talk about payments to farmers for something other than their production, we can think of it in two ways. We can either look at it as financing a transition, and for a period of time, farmers that are going through the J curve of this transition will need support, but that will come to an end. And maybe we need to look at it differently, which is farmers are providing a valuable service to society and to their environment. And as long as they're providing that service that has a value, it should be recognized. And the thought I want to leave you with is, how should that value be recognized? Thank you very much. This has been very interesting. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. I think that was very inspiring and food for thought. It's a bit challenging to make a conclusion of this event. So I'll only try to make some recap of what we have heard and listened to today. So Michael Pielke gave us the context from the perspective of the Commission and reminded of the different policies that are driving or supporting the efforts by the farming sector. We had Thomas Weins highlighting the possible scenarios for decarbonization in our plants. I think that was very helpful. He gave us also his assessment of possible mitigation strategies, and I remembered, and I don't think we would contradict here, energy efficiency improvement, enhanced biomass use, and the last one was electrification. Stefan Gekire showed what can be achieved or expected from a sector-wide monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions. Nothing particularly spectacular at this stage, but it has the merit of existing. It's maybe a starting point, certainly a starting point, and members can get a grip on where they stand, and obviously this is work in progress, so by no means an endpoint. Then we had a fascinating panel moderated by Chuck, thank you very much, with Gerard Ross, Claude Soudé and Sébastien Roumégou, who provided us an understanding of what carbon sequestration means. I think also the very educational part was absolutely useful. And provided insights into best practices, well, both the opportunities and the challenges on how to improve carbon performance. Now, I noted a couple of points which, and I think Chuck's point at the end was very relevant, but I share some other thoughts. So there is obviously a concern about how to incentivize farmers, not only for the transition, but potentially also beyond, providing new revenues. I think that was one of the key questions posed. Also, the recognition that we are quite carbon-centric on our approach. While in a way everything is interlinked, and on the field at least, and it's also complex. And the question whether we should not look at it in a broader sense and consider the other benefits that can be related to biodiversity, to water or other uses beyond the mere or the simple carbon. And then I also noted that regulation is maybe not always conducive. I think this is obviously also something that was underlined. That's something that needs to be looked at. I'm going to stop here. It's by no means comprehensive conclusion. I think there is more to be looked at. I would simply say that the discussion we've had shows that there is merit in continuing the dialogue, because we have understood that this is, maybe we have looked here at our scope 3, but it is obviously, and we understand, really a chain approach that needs to be done, so there is merit for us to continue the dialogue. I'd like to thank all the panelists and moderator, and also the participants for the very interesting discussions we've had today, and I think that closes the meeting. I invite you to a lunch. Thank you very much.